Namaskar. Sri Aurobindo the Sonneteer. The topic for today's discussion is to study Sri Aurobindo's aspect of him as a sonneteer. What is a sonnet? And why are we studying it? Why does it form any significance for Sri Aurobindo's writings? We know Savitri is of paramount importance in all the writings of Sri Aurobindo. Even Mother has said that Savitri is the message, that everything else was a preparation, but Savitri is the message. However, sonnets also have a great significance when we study Sri Aurobindo, his writings, and especially his life. By tradition, we know that sonnet as a form of poetry is written to express the inner expression, the inner feelings, motivations, emotions, ideas, thoughts of the poet. And this is exactly what we get in Sri Aurobindo's sonnet. There are certain things that he has not mentioned in his letters, certain experiences which he did not choose to write to anyone. Those he has expressed in his sonnets. In a very condensed form, one may expand, one may research deeper into what he meant when he wrote all that. What was that experience? In what time did he experience those things? Or was it the same time as he wrote the sonnet, or an experience he had before? A lot of things, a lot of research can be done. We can delve deeper into each one of the sonnets. And each one surely will give us a greater insight into Sri Aurobindo's own life. Because Sri Aurobindo told us not to write his biography, he emphatically mentioned that his life was not on the surface for us to see. That means, where do we get to know about his life? It is through his sonnets, it is through his Savitri. Sonnets more so because they are very personal. And as I mentioned, by definition, sonnets are an expression of the inner life of the poet. So we will see why and how Sri Aurobindo has emerged as a master craftsman of these sonneteers, not only because he has written sonnets, not only because he has made rhythmic experiments, but he has expanded, evolved the very scope of the form and the content of sonnet. It is not the first attempt. There were poets in the past who have developed further the sonnet's form as it existed from the times of Shakespeare and Milton. But the way Sri Aurobindo has helped it develop is what we call the future poetry. And we will see and we will study how he has led us into that future. So in Shakespeare's hand, when sonnets came into the English language, it was developed by Shakespeare when he wrote his sonnets on the fair boy or the fair young man and on the dark lady. It went into the hands of Milton and Donne, and they were again developed in scope, style and theme. Later on, other poets like Wordsworth and Hopkins and others, they also adapted this form, wrote a lot of sonnets, and they did what they would like to with the form, content, subject and scope of it. We will see as we go along. But broadly speaking, there are two forms, Shakespearean and Miltonic. Shakespearean has 3 stanzas with 4 lines and 1 stanza with 2 lines. And Miltonic sonnet has 1 stanza with 8 lines and another with 6 lines. So for the Shakespearean one, we will call them 4 quartets and 1 couplet. 3 quartets and 1 couplet. And for Milton's, we call 1 octet and 1 sestet. These are slightly technical terms that we need to know, because as we read Sri Aurobindo's poems, we will see that he has amply made use of it. He has even told us about the structural difference of why and what of Milton's sonnet and Shakespearean sonnet. It is also important that while he wrote in these two forms, he made internal changes, not only in the rhyme and rhythm, but in the very scope, the very elevation, the very texture of the poetry. And when he did so, while he maintained the form, in one of his letters he mentions what kind of structure is that of a Miltonic sonnet and what kind of a structure is that of a Shakespearean sonnet. And we will study those in his own poetry. Before we begin with Sri Aurobindo's sonnets, one of the very interesting letters I would like to relate to here is perhaps there was one person who wrote some sonnets and sent to Sri Aurobindo for his comments. Sri Aurobindo was impressed, but he says, he writes a one-page letter and he says, gives him a background of the sonnets that existed in English language, gave him the structure of Shakespearean and Miltonic sonnets, and then he says, you are asking me to tell you whether your sonnets are of the standard or not, or they are perfect or not. But he says, if you want to experiment in the sonnets, you should be well grounded first in the traditional forms. After that, you are free to experiment. And this is what we exactly see with Sri Aurobindo. In his early sonnets, he has followed the rhythm, the pattern, the theme, the scope of the ancients or of the old sonneteers. And then when he was adept in those, he wrote or he developed his own style. So he followed what he wrote to his disciple or the poet or the aspiring poet in that letter. And that's why we see that Sri Aurobindo always follows this policy of tradition and individual talent. Where he does follow the tradition, slowly when he has mastered the tradition, he breaks free from it, and there comes in his individuality, his personal or impersonal mark on that piece of work, on poetry, on any other writing. So what Sri Aurobindo has done for two sonnets is he has helped to evolve them. How? That we are going to study in this paper on 2 or 3 different parameters. But in one of his writings, The Future Poetry, Sri Aurobindo says, poetry, like everything else in man, evolves. He starts with this premise. He has this in mind, that like the human being evolves, the society evolves, poetry too evolves. And we all know that in the future poetry, Sri Aurobindo has traced the entire trend of the evolution of poetry in English from Chaucer till his times. So he was very conscious of what he was doing. He knew that poetry was evolving, there is a certain pattern, and he would also prophesize or envision or see a gradual trend in what poetry could be in future. And that's what we study in his poetry, and so he sees this in sonnets as well. Now, having said that the poetry evolves, we will study this concept on 3 parameters or on 3 aspects. 1. The evolution of form and content of sonnets by Sri Aurobindo. 2. Sonnets as an index of Sri Aurobindo's spiritual experiences. So what are those spiritual experiences which have found expression in his sonnets? And 3. Sonnets and Savitri. So the first one, the evolution of form and content. First is the evolution of content. I start. We have seen that this Shakespearean sonnet or Miltonic sonnet have been there in existence. Now, what was the content of Shakespeare's sonnet? It was mostly his feelings of love, compassion, his wanting to convince his friend, the fair young boy, the fair young man, for certain things, praising him. He has in fact praised the dark lady and the fair young man. So these are the themes to which Shakespeare stuck to. A very limited, perhaps, but a very wide imaginative thing. Of course, there is nowhere proven who this young man was or who this dark lady was, but as we know that sonnets are a personal expression, possibly they were very, very close to him. So this was Shakespeare's scope. Now this scope was slightly altered and expanded by Milton and Donne, the two other English poets. They made it a little more philosophical because the poets themselves were of philosophical bent. They brought in the concept of philosophy, thought of philosophy. So their longings were more philosophical, more ideological. I wouldn't call it spiritual here yet. So they were more ideological and philosophical. So those we find in Milton's and Donne's poetry, Donne's sonnets. Then comes William Wordsworth, who expanded it further, who has expanded the scope, the content of the sonnets further, and he brought almost all life into it. He would write about city, nature, circumstances, people. So he would write about everything that was close to him, not just his feelings, but his feelings about the city, his feelings about the life, about circumstances, about people, about any incident. He would write about all that in his sonnets. So it had already assumed a very, very large canvas by the time sonnets came to be handed over to Sri Aurobindo. Now what Sri Aurobindo sees is it was well developed. Sonnet was a well developed form. It had a rhythm, it had a pattern. Wordsworth also altered a lot of rhythmic patterns in his sonnets. But what was lacking, if we were to say, in that sonnet was, in the scope of the sonnet was the spiritual aspect, the higher life. What these poets were writing were about the inner feelings, about the philosophical thought, about the outer life. But there is a higher life, there was a higher life which was missing, an inner spiritual life that was missing. And this is Sri Aurobindo's contribution to the content of the sonnets. How we will be seeing it now. So when Sri Aurobindo talks of the evolution of sonnets, he just does not leave it saying that poetry will evolve or poetry does evolve. He gives the footsteps of on what lines it's going to evolve. That's why he says, a change in the spirit of poetry must necessarily bring with it a change of its form. So what we every time saw that there was a need in the scope of poetry to evolve, the form did alter a bit. Similarly, here also Sri Aurobindo says that when the poetry or sonnet is elevated to a particular level, it will automatically give birth to a new form. It may remain a 14-line poem, but it may not necessarily form the Shakespearean or Miltonic rhythm. So we will see here in Sri Aurobindo's poems, in his sonnets, how he has changed or how he has kept to the old forms. Now, he also says that a form does not, the change of the form does not necessarily mean the breaking of the entire mold, old mold. That means, as I said, 14 lines will remain 14 lines in a sonnet. Even the rhythmic pattern like A, B, B, A that we have in Milton's sonnet, or like whatever rhythm A, B we have in Shakespeare's sonnets, that may remain or may not remain, it doesn't matter. They are all only externals. But what will change and what we will realize as a change is the very spirit of poetry, the very elevation of poetry, the very level from which it is written and the level to which it appeals. Obviously, when we read Shakespeare's sonnets or Wordsworth's sonnets, the appeal is to our love for nature, our adoration for a city, our relation with a human being. But when we read Sri Aurobindo's sonnets, automatically we have to take a step inwards. We have to understand that Sri Aurobindo is talking about the great inner worlds, the spiritual worlds, not only the worlds of emotion and thought, but he's talking of greater spiritual heights, deeper spiritual heights in his sonnets. And that is where the content has been changed. That is where the content becomes tangible. I will read a poem now from Sri Aurobindo's, I'll read a sonnet and then we will discuss it further. I housed within my heart the life of things. All hearts athrob in the world I felt as mine. I shared the joy that in creation sings, and drank its sorrow like a poignant wine. A deep spiritual calm no touch can sway upholds the mystery of this passion play. Here I have read one quotlet and one couplet from the poem Life Unity. Now this is a beautiful experience that Sri Aurobindo has when he becomes one, when he realizes that his inner being is one with everything outside in the world, everything that is alive in the world. He has become one with that. And that's how he says, I housed within my heart the life of things. That means the life element of plants, of leaves, of ants, of insects, of human beings, of animals, everything he has housed within him. That means he has become so large, or he has become so much one with all the nature, that he is able to share their joy. I shared the joy that in creation sings, and drank its sorrow like a poignant wine. So we see that his heart, his emotion, his width, his consciousness has become one, where he is able to experience joy and sorrow and suffering with all the living beings of the world. And he himself mentions here in the couplet, a deep spiritual calm no touch can sway, upholds the mystery of this passion play. And passion he mentions in capital P. So it's not the lower passion of a human being. It is a very strong feeling, a wave, a vibration of a very deep being. And that is the psychic being. So one becomes one with others only when there is a psychic awakening. And that is where this poem expresses Sri Aurobindo's unity with the other people based on the psychic being. Here what is important is that he has developed this feeling out of his yogic tapasya. It is a very, very Upanishadic experience. It is an experience where one has expanded in his heart, in his emotions, in his aspirations for everyone. So there is a unity, there is a oneness. And that is one experience aligned in the Shakespearean form of sonnet. Similarly, we see two more sonnets which are based on written like Miltonic sonnets without changing the rhyme and rhythm of his sonnet. But what is important is Sri Aurobindo gives in one of his letters what is the Miltonic sonnet. He says a Miltonic sonnet is expressed and has a strong armored structure of the thought or a carefully developed unity of the building. We will see how two of his poems are based on that. A strong armored structure of thought. Now the first poem for our consideration is the poem called Evolution. Sri Aurobindo has written two poems on evolution, one in the Shakespearean style and one in the Miltonic style. I am here taking note of the one written in Miltonic style, that is with an octet and octet and a sestet. What I want to highlight here is that this poem has a strong armored structure. So if we read the poem, I passed into a lucent, still abode, and saw as in a mirror crystalline, an ancient force ascending serpentine, the unhasting spirals of the Aeonic road. Earth was a cradle of the arriving God, and man but a half-dark, half-luminous sign of the transition of the veiled divine, and matter's sleep and the tormented load, of the ignorant life and death to the spirit's light. Mind liberated, swam light's ocean vast, and life escaped from its grey tortured line. I saw matter illumining its parent night. The soul could feel into infinity cast, timeless God bliss, the heart incarnadine. What's interesting in this poem I would like to highlight is a few words like crystalline, serpentine, incarnadine. These are very kind of archaic words. These people do not use them. And in fact, they are very Shakespearean words because Shakespeare seems to have used these words a lot. But this gives the density to the poem. I passed into a lucent, still abode, and saw as in a mirror crystalline, an ancient force ascending serpentine, the unhasting spirals of the Aeonic road. So what is happening is, in front of Sri Aurobindo, like a mirror, the entire evolution is as if passing like a picture. He's able to see it like as clearly as one would see in a mirror. The unhasting spirals of the Aeonic road. We have to mark each line here. We cannot go too much in detail of these poems, but we have to understand that the unhasting spirals means nature is not in a hurry to evolve, and it's an Aeonic march, it's an Aeonic journey that evolution has been going through. I mean, we are going through evolution in this, and it's a spiral evolution, it's not a linear evolution. So these are very, very small things that we will be able to read into each one of these sonnets, but here I am giving only an overview. So what I wanted to highlight here was a strong armored structure. So in the very first 8 lines, Sri Aurobindo gives a solid explanation of what was the evolution like, that he watches this evolution. Now in the next sestet, in the next 6 lines, he speaks of how the mind or the life or matter has been liberated in these. First, he sees the evolution till matter, life and mind, and then he sees how it is liberated. So there is a continuity of giving a thesis and concluding his argument there. Now the next one. The next is the Sonnet Shiva. At the first instance, one may feel that since Sri Aurobindo had a very close connection with Lord Shiva, that Lord Shiva used to visit him very often, maybe he would have written something of his experience in that manner. But what is again significant is he has used an imagery of Shiva, of Lord Shiva, to show the relation of the Lord or the Absolute or the Creator, if you want to say, use the word, not necessarily, but still. So Shiva is the one who is responsible to create this world, and Shakti is the one who is responsible to maintain this world, or Shiva through Shakti has created this world, if we were to say in the very Upanishadic or in Sri Aurobindo's context. Now he has been very, very powerfully able to compact this entire concept into 14 lines. And that's why Sri Aurobindo himself says, a carefully developed unity of building. So in the first 6 lines, first 8 lines, Sri Aurobindo gives us how Shiva is sitting in a poise, on what heights is he sitting, that he is meditating, that he is in that eternal, tapasvi mode. And in the second one, that he is not aloof of this world. He has maintained a connection, and that connection is the mighty mother, the Shakti of Shiva, who is overlooking this world, who is responsible to run this world. But ultimately, the Shiva and Shakti both are also same, one and the same. So it is, as Sri Aurobindo says, the Shakti of Shiva. They are not Shakti and Shiva. So that is very, very powerfully brought out in this poem Shiva. I'll read only a few lines. Life springs in her and mind is born. Her face she lifts to him who is herself, until the spirit leaps into the spirit's embrace. These are the last 3 lines only that I have read, more to show how Shiva and Shakti, Ishvara and Ishwari, or the feminine and the masculine aspects of the divine are actually one. But mark the line, her face she lifts to him who is herself. So there is absolute identity between Shiva and Shakti. It's only the functional roles in this creation that have changed. Now the first part is complete in itself. If we read this first part of the 8 lines, it feels complete in itself in the sense that it is speaking about the static Shiva, the tapasvi Shiva, Lord Shiva, who is sitting on the summits of the Himalayas. Whereas in the second part, again it is complete because it speaks of the philosophy of the Purusha and Prakriti, of the Ishvara and the Ishwari being one. And this entire thing forms a complete unity. And that's why carefully developed unity of building is seen in not only the structure, the outer structure of this poem, the Miltonic structure of this poem, but even in the very internal unity that has been woven in this theme. This also demands a lot of study. Each of these sonnets, in fact, can be developed, can be studied deeper. Now, we have seen that Sri Aurobindo, in the last few examples that we studied, Sri Aurobindo has utilized Shakespeare's and Miltonic's sonnet styles and has wonderfully elevated the whole content and the theme and written his sonnets. In the next few examples, I will just mention the names of the poems here, where he has changed the very rhythmic pattern of his poems and in fact has synthesized or amalgamated or interpolated, rather he has interpolated the rhythmic patterns of Shakespeare and Milton both. These poems are Man the Thinking Animal, Contrast, The Ways of the Spirit, Science and the Unknowable, Now I Am Born, The Indwelling Spirit Within, Creation. They have broken away from the traditional rhyme scheme of Shakespeare and Milton, and they have interpolated. I will read few lines from a poem called The Ways of the Spirit. The Spirit keeps for him its ample ways, a sense that takes the world into our being, a close illumined touch and intimate seeing, wide thought that is a God ensphering gaze, a tranquil heart in sympathy with all, a will wide-winging, armed, imperial. So he has of course explained here the ways of the Spirit. We will not go deeper into it, but please mark here the terms ways and gaze, being, seeing, all and imperial. This forms typically the rhythm of, the first four form the rhythm of Miltonic sonnet. So he has brought this in Shakespearean sonnet. So he has maintained the lyrical quality of Shakespearean sonnet, bringing in the solid structure of Milton's poems. Now next. Till here we were seeing how Sri Aurobindo has experimented in content and form of sonnets. We go a little deeper. When he defines the future poetry of what would be the future of sonnets, he gives certain clues of what would be that future poetry. And the clue is not just for the sonnets, but the entire genre of lyrical poetry, that is odes and ballads and sonnets, etc. So I will read a small passage from the future poetry, and then we will analyze this in Sri Aurobindo's own sonnets. The characteristics of the new lyric poetry is what Sri Aurobindo is going to speak about. The lyrical impulse is the original and spontaneous creator of the poetic form. Song, the first discovery of the possibility of a higher, because a rhythmic intensity of self-expression. It wells out from the intensity of touch and the spiritualized emotion of a more delicate or a deeper and more penetrating sight and feeling in the experience, captures and sustains the inevitable cadences of its joy or its attraction, sets the subtle measure of its feeling and keeps it by the magic of its steps in sound vibrating on the inner strings and psychic fibers. This is almost just 2 sentences that I read, but a lot is packed in these two. We have something like a rhythmic intensity of self-expression, intensity of touch and spiritual emotion, delicate and deeper and more penetrating sight, inner strings of and psychic fibers, the joy, cadences of joy and attraction. So there are lots. Each of these phrases actually can be analyzed in Sri Aurobindo's poetry or in other sonnets which have been written to see whether these parameters are applicable to them or not. I'm here using only a few parameters, not all of them, to see that Sri Aurobindo himself, he is not just given theory. Why we are applying his own theory, which he, in fact, the theory that he has given in the future poetry. I'm sorry if I'm calling it theory. It is not theory. His vision of the future poetry that he has given in his treatise, how he has exemplified that in his own sonnets later on. So this he wrote somewhere between 1917 to 1921, but his sonnets were written much later, after 1933, between 1933 and 47. So we see that he has fulfilled that vision that he had much earlier in his life. So before we move on to these qualities, what is important to understand is, it is not just the form and the content that have changed with the ancient English poets. What has also changed is the manner in which poetry was conceived or composed or received. So the first Sri Aurobindo says that lyric is very spontaneous expression of the soul. It is like a child babbling. So there is a spontaneity, there is a joy, there is a freshness in sonnets. So when it was born earlier, it had that freshness. But slowly what happened? Reason came in. If we read sometimes even to an extent Donne's sonnets or Milton's sonnet, there is a slight reasoning in that. Because this happened, this is happening. And that's how this Miltonic style also has come, that there is a thesis and there is a conclusion, or there is a follow-up thought in that. So it became a reflective reason. So it lost, the moment reason comes, it loses the spontaneity. Then what happened with other romantic poets? Imagination came in. So possibly a lot of things that Wordsworth wrote had some imagination in it, some fancy in it, fanciful thinking or imaginative thinking in it. Again, it was not as spontaneous as it should have been in the beginning. So it kept on going a little farther from its native elements. And those native elements, Sri Aurobindo says that it had an intuitive or an instinctive way of expression. Instinctive I would not use, but an intuitive way. And that needs to come back. And what more needs to be added into this sonnet is the power of identity of the spirit. So there are two basic elements that the poetry of the future, or the sonnets of the future, need to have in order to elevate themselves, in order to evolve. One is power of the native intuition of itself by life, and the power of identity of the spirit. These are the two things. Of course, for the paucity of time, we are not expanding on these ideas. We move further. Now, as we discussed the characteristics or the traits that Sri Aurobindo has given in the paragraph that we read, one of the parameters is sonnets are a vehicle of higher self-expression. Up until now, we saw that sonnets were a vehicle of one's inner feelings, emotions, etc. that we have repeated many a time. But now he says expression of a higher, vehicles of higher self-expression. How is it so? We will read in few lines from Sri Aurobindo's, in fact the full poem from Sri Aurobindo's poem, Because Thou Art. Reading this poem itself, we will understand how it has become a vehicle of Sri Aurobindo's higher self-expression. Because thou art all beauty and all bliss, my soul blind and enamored yearns for thee. It bears thy mystic touch in all that is, and thrills with the burden of that ecstasy. Behind all eyes I meet thy secret gaze, and in each voice I hear thy magic tune. Thy sweetness hunts my heart through nature's ways. Nowhere it beats now from thy snare immune. It loves thy body in all living things. Thy joy is there in every leaf and stone. The moments bring thee on their fiery wings. Sight's endless artistry is thou alone. Time voyages with thee upon its brow, and all the future's passionate hope is thou. A beautiful experience because thou art, because the divine is present in this world. Everything seems a magic tune. He hears the magic tune. He sees, behind all eyes I meet thy secret gaze. So Sri Aurobindo, in fact, we know by his experience in Alipur jail, he is able to see Sri Krishna everywhere. He is able to experience Brahman everywhere. Later on he writes in his writings. So his eyes, behind all eyes I meet thy secret gaze. So he is able to penetrate through everything around and see there is a divine hand, there is a divine sitting there in everything. So it loves thy body in all living things. So there is no discrimination in Sri Aurobindo. Everything is divine, everything is made by the divine or is inhabited by the divine, and therefore every living thing, he loves that. And not only living thing, thy joy is there in every leaf and stone. So in his eyes, in his sight, in his hearing, in all his senses, all his outer and inner senses, he is able to feel the divine. So because thou art, there is hope, he says. Time voyages with thee upon its brow, and all the future's passionate hope is thou. So because thou art, there is so much hope, there is so much joy, there is so many miracles on earth. Now again, this is a very, very philosophic experience. He is able to see Brahman in all this, but we see how in a condensed format, he is able to express it in these 14 lines. Similarly, a very potent poem which expresses Sri Aurobindo's inner life, inner experience, is the poem called Surrender. Here, if we read the poem, we will realize that he says that I have made myself an instrument, a perfect instrument of the divine, where my mind, my heart, my will, my body, my nerves, everything has become a channel for the divine. So he has surrendered everything. He has given up himself. He has given his individuality, as in that he does not stand in between the divine's wish or the divine wanting to do any work through him. He is ready for that. He is an absolutely perfectly carved out instrument. But towards the end he says, keep only my soul to adore eternally, and meet thee in each form and soul of thee. So he has surrendered himself, but he wants to keep only that part, that soul in him, which is able to enjoy the divine in each one of his manifestation. And that is what we exactly see in the previous poem, because thou art. So he is able to see the divine in everything, and for which he wants to keep his soul despite his surrender. So this is not a sequel, but we see these two inner experiences interlinked. There are other poems like this, like The Golden Light, Transformation, Cosmic Consciousness, Divine Sight, etc. But we will deal with these as we go along. Now the next parameter that we may think of, or the Sri Aurobindo has highlighted, is the intensity of touch. Now we need to remember here one thing, that most of the experience that Sri Aurobindo had all through his life, they were kind of settled experience in him. They were not the experiences which just came and left, as we get in our meditation. Sometimes in our meditation we feel the quietness, we are able to see light or hear some sound or feel very, very peaceful during the meditation. But when we come out of it, we are not able to maintain that consciousness or that stature or that poise, because of many different reasons. That we are not purified, we have not practiced enough, we have not expanded ourselves enough to contain that. But here Sri Aurobindo speaks of the intensity of touch which has become settled experience in his being. One such poem is Transformation, and the other is The Golden Light. Please mark, the transformation was written in 1934, and the Golden Light was written sometimes in 1938 but was revised in 1944. Now, we will come to this analysis when we speak of Savitri, but we need to remember that these sonnets were written around the time when Sri Aurobindo was trying to pull down the supermind and was simultaneously working on Savitri. So, that intensity of touch, what happens? The change comes upon him when he is trying to draw such a high force, the supermind down. Obviously, there will be a change in himself, and that change is what he sees has come upon him in his poem Transformation. I am no more a slave to nature, her laden rule. I'll read the poem because it's very powerful to understand, to know the change Sri Aurobindo goes through. My breath runs in a subtle rhythmic stream. It fills my members with a might divine. I have drunk the infinite like a giant's wine. Time is my drama or my pageant dream. Now are my illumined cells joy's flaming scheme, and changed my thrilled and branching nerves to find channels of rapture, opal and hyaline, for the influx of the unknown and the supreme. I am no more a vassal of the flesh, a slave to nature and her laden rule. I am caught no more in the senses' narrow mesh. My soul unhorizoned widens to measureless sight. My body is God's happy living tool. My spirit, a vast sun of deathless light. If one reads this poem 3, 4, 5 times, we would be able to not experience but slightly understand or relate or be able to appreciate this poem much better, because these are simple words, not beyond our experience, but at the same time we would know the expanse, the way Sri Aurobindo has experienced. My spirit, a vast sun of deathless light. That's what he has experienced in this, and that he has come out of this chain of nature. He is no more a slave of this nature, this outer nature, that he has completely got control. He is able to get over that, and now his spirit is vast. Next, having this transformation of this liberation from nature, next comes a mightier transformation, that of the golden light. Now, since Sri Aurobindo was busy drawing down the supermind, obviously perhaps there would be some experience of the golden light descending on him. And as far as my little reading goes, I have not found a letter to corroborate this experience of Sri Aurobindo in his writings. Possibly there would be a scholar or researcher who would be able to find something like this, but to my little reading, I have not found anything to corroborate any letter, any such experience which Sri Aurobindo has narrated in his writings. So this is the only proof of his inner change that we get in this sonnet. The sonnet is called The Golden Light. I'll read it through, but we will slightly analyze and move further. I'll read only 6 lines here. Thy golden light came down into my heart, smiting my life with thy eternity. Now has it grown a temple where thou art, and all its passions point towards only thee. Thy golden light came into my feet. My earth is now thy playfield and thy seat. Here basically what is happening is, Sri Aurobindo explains that the golden light came down into my brain, golden light came down into my throat, golden light came down into my heart, and then into my feet. So these are the energy centers or the chakras that we call, which he says that golden light has touched upon, has come into these chakras and have changed them, have transformed them. So in his Sukshma Sharira or in his subtle body, this light, golden light has descended and has marked a change and has effected a change. So that is this poem all about. This we see only a corroboration in Savitri. That of course it's a matter of study of what is the change that Savitri goes through when her chakras open or when they are transformed, and what Sri Aurobindo writes here, but that of course needs a separate study. Now next, the third parameter is penetrating sight and feeling in experience. Now this I will not elaborate much because there are poems Sri Aurobindo has written on science, on electron, on atom, and we will see that there is a penetrating sight. Since he has identified with the living and the non-living, animate and the inanimate things in this manifestation, he has got that penetrating sight and feeling in experience. And this we see very clearly in his poems that he has written on science. I'll just read a few lines from his poem, Electron. The electron on which forms and worlds are built leaped into being a particle of God. A spark from the eternal energy spilt. It is the infinite's blind, minute abode. In that small, flaming chariot, Shiva rides. Who can imagine Shiva riding in a small electron? We know electron is it's a subatomic particle. And he says that the electron on which the forms and worlds are built, and on that Shiva rides on his chariot. Flaming chariot Shiva rides. So these are the deep insights even into matter that Sri Aurobindo has gained. And that is why when he says that I see, in the previous poem when he sees that behind everything I see the divine. It is this divine, Shiva riding every electron that he sees. Now we move on to the second section. As we mentioned initially, 3 sections. The second section is Sonnets as an index of Sri Aurobindo's spiritual experiences. Of course, we have been seeing all this while we have seen the spiritual experiences only, because sonnets are nothing but that. But here I have tried to classify a few of them for our better understanding, because they also corroborate with some of his letters that he has written to the disciples regarding these experiences. So earlier one we have to sort of interpret or analyze or appreciate on their own to a large extent, but here we get a clear demarcation of what kind of experiences they are, and we can study it deeper at a later time. So there are basically 3 experiences of the divine on 3 levels that Sri Aurobindo has mentioned. That is on the transcendental level, universal level, and the individual level. On the individual level is when one has the psychic opening and one is able to feel that he is eternal, he is immortal, there is constant joy, there is constant oneness with the other. Universal is the one when one has widened to such an extent that there is, like what we saw, he is able to see the divine in everything. There is an expanse of consciousness. The whole world feels like the body of the poet or the person who has realized it. And transcendental, of course I can't define it, but transcendental is something that is beyond this world, beyond this manifestation. That is the experience. So his poems like The Divine Worker, The Guest, The Bliss of Brahman, Surrender, about which we have already mentioned. These are some of the poems that I have selected, which we can call as his individual level experiences, as his poems written based on his psychic experiences. One such poem with a few lines I will read, The Bliss of Brahman. I am drunken with the glory of the Lord. I am vanquished by the beauty of the unborn. I have looked alive on the Eternal's face. My mind is cloven by his radiant sword. My heart by his beatific touch is torn. My life is a meteor dust of his flaming grace. So beautiful. Sri Aurobindo in his previous sonnets, when we studied Surrender, he says, I have given up everything, my mind, my heart, my will, my nerves, my body, everything has become a channel for the divine. I've just kept my soul to adore thee. Here also again the same sense of annihilation, same sense of not being the I, not being oneself, not being the individual narrow self. And that's why he says, my life is a meteor dust of his flaming grace. Meteor is as it is very small and it's dust. So he has kind of annihilated himself when he calls himself a meteor dust. Similarly, the poem Guest. I have discovered my deep, deathless being, masked by my front of mind, immense, serene. It meets the world with an immortal seeing, a God spectator of the human scene. What is important, what I would like to highlight here is, I have discovered my deep, deathless being. That deep, deathless being is psychic being, or the soul maybe. So the sense of immortal is native to the psychic being, and that's why Sri Aurobindo doesn't say I have discovered my deep being, but he says I have discovered my deep deathless being. And that of course refers to the psychic being. Moving on, so these were the experiences based on the psychic being, and then we call them individual experiences of the divine on the individual level. Then on the universal level, Sri Aurobindo says that when one rises to the universal level, he gets experiences of the self being free, infinite, silent, inactive. And then he also has direct experiences of cosmic energies and forces and their formations. So we see in his poems that we have both these experiences of the infinite, the silence, the inactive, as well as the experiences of the cosmic energies in the forms of gods and goddesses. His poems like The Hilltop Temple, Shiva, Krishna, the Stone Goddess, they are all examples of him experiencing the cosmic energy or its forces. One small poem, one sonnet, The Hilltop Temple. After unnumbered steps of a hill stair, I saw upon earth's head, brilliant with sun, the immobile goddess in her house of stone, in a loneliness of meditating air. So Sri Aurobindo, we all know this poem is based on his trek to Parvati, the small hill in Pune town, possibly around 1902, when he used to go to Pune, and between Pune and Baroda he used to travel. And that time he perhaps walked up to Parvati one day, and there was a small temple of a Devi, and he is able to see, I saw upon earth's head, brilliant with sun, the immobile goddess in her house of stone. Immobile goddess in her house of stone. So he is able to see the deity, the goddess there, in that house of stone, in that temple there. So that is an experience which he had in 1902, but he only wrote this sonnet in 1939. So he has recollected it from his experiences and mentioned it here. Not quoting more poems on his experiences of the cosmic godheads, because we know that when he even saw the stone goddess in Karnali near Baroda, he saw the Kali emerging out of the statue, and he wrote a poem on that. His identity with Sri Krishna, he wrote a poem on that. His vision of the Shiva, of Lord Shiva, that we have already discussed. So these are some of the things that we leave for our own personal reading. Now the next one is, as he says, the infinite, silent, inactive aspect of the Lord, is a poem called Cosmic Consciousness. I have wrapped the wide world in my wider self, and time and space and my spirit's seeing are. I am the god and demon, ghost and elf. I am the wind's speed and the blazing star. It's really very, very, very wide, even when Sri Aurobindo writes, I am the wind's speed and the blazing star. Now one can just sit and try to expand one's imagination, or go in deep meditation to even imagine what these lines, what these words would mean, what these phrases would mean. So I shall not elaborate it here. My idea was to bring it to your notice, that I have wrapped the wide world in my wider self. Wide world in my wider self. And time and space are my spirit's seeing. Time and space my spirit's seeing are. So we really need to sit quietly and meditate on these lines. The last one is in this second section that we are discussing is of the transcendental level, where we have this poem called Advaita. We know it is based on Sri Aurobindo's experience when he had visited Kashmir, the Shankaracharya hill in 1903, and where he experienced the Nirguna Brahman the way Sri Shankaracharya, Sri Adi Shankaracharya had experienced. And that is how he wrote this poem in 1939. Around me was a formless solitude. All had become one strange, unnameable. An unborn soul reality, world nude, topless and fathomless, forever still. This is a very concrete experience that he has there, but it's of a transcendental level, which he has expressed in this sonnet. Now we move on to the last section, where we will see what are the similarities, or what is the connection between sonnets and Savitri, or is there a connection between sonnet and Savitri? Now we have mentioned it earlier that when Sri Aurobindo wrote sonnets, major sonnets, between 1933 and 1947, this was the time when he was ascending the levels of consciousness, stabilizing on those levels, trying to bring down one level after the other, and simultaneously was writing poetry so that it could reach a higher level of consciousness. So here I would like to read a poem to just mark a difference between Savitri and sonnets, but then we will see a few similarities. We are quite familiar with this letter of Sri Aurobindo written in 1936, where he says, I used Savitri as a means of ascension. I began with it on a certain mental level. Each time I could reach a higher level, I rewrote from that level. Further, towards the end of this letter, he writes, in fact, Savitri has not been regarded by me as a poem to be written and finished, but as a field of experimentation to see how far poetry could be written from one's own yogic consciousness and how that could be made creative. I did not rewrite Rose of God or the sonnets except for 2 or 3 verbal alterations made at the moment. This was written in 1936. We know after this Sri Aurobindo did rewrite. In fact, a lot of poems we see he has touched upon later on in 1944. The poems that he wrote in 34 or 1938, he did revisit them in 1944 many times and he rewrote them. Now, it's a matter of study as to what was the first draft and what was the second draft, what were the changes that we can see in them. But at this time, when he says that I was trying to experiment with Savitri, he was not trying to experiment with poems. He was just expressing them, leaving them as it is. But maybe the way when he says that he experimented with Savitri and saw from where the inspiration has come, he has possibly done the same thing when he was revising his sonnets, because obviously we are aware that his mind was quiet. He only received the inspiration. So obviously when he was revising the sonnets also, he would have revised it with that consciousness which was itself dictating him to change the word, the rhythm, whatever he would have changed in those sonnets. Also in one of the earlier letters in 1934, he wrote in the context of Savitri, but here I read the poem, the part on the poem. The poems come as a stream, beginning at the first line and ending at the last. Only some remain with 1 or 2 changes. Others have to be recast if the first inspiration was an inferior one. Savitri is a work by itself, unlike all others. I made some 8 or 10 recasts of it originally under the old insufficient inspiration. Afterwards, I am altogether rewriting it, concentrating on the first book and working on it over and over again. So what I am trying to suggest here is, that when he wrote the poem, it came as one unit to him. At least in 1934, when he had only started working on Savitri. Until then, when he started writing these sonnets, he used to get that as one unit, as en masse, as he says. The first line to the last line he would get as it is, from a level of inspiration, and that's how we have these poems he has written. And if he were to recast, means he has to, suppose if he has written it in a Shakespearean mold and he gets a second inspiration as a Miltonic mold, he would completely do away with the previous thing and he would change the entire thing under the new inspiration, which of course he says I did with Savitri as well. He changed and recast it some 7 to 8 times, he mentions. So there are certain similarities. There is a way in which Sri Aurobindo wrote Savitri and possibly a way in which he revised his sonnets also. Now a few similarities that we will see. One of Sri Aurobindo's very intense sonnet is the Pilgrim of Night. And this poem, in which he says that he had his rendezvous with darkness, with night, where he says comes no voice of celestial friend. It's all, dark, dingy, horrifying, slimy place where he doesn't see any friend because nobody has nobody has traveled into night. So he doesn't find a friend, no footsteps of anybody who would have come to that place ever before. So it's a very, if to the human mind we would say a very scary, a very filthy space. But Sri Aurobindo travels there with the God's deathless light. He goes there. And if you read this poem, it's extremely powerful. But to complement it, we would say, those 14 lines of his descent into night, or what he calls the Pilgrim of the Night, it has been expanded into a very beautiful, wonderful canto called the Descent into Night in Savitri. It certainly, I would feel when I read it, I felt it was an expansion of this idea. I'll read a couple of lines. Assailed by thoughts that swarmed like spectral hordes, a prey to the staring phantoms of the gloom, and terror approaching with its lethal mouth, driven by a strange will down ever down, the sky above a communique of doom. He strove to shield his spirit from despair, but felt the horror of the growing night, and the abyss rising to claim his soul. So we have to compare these two poems, the sonnet and Savitri's lines, to understand the experience that Sri Aurobindo and Ashwapati go through. What is noticeable here is that in sonnets he has used everywhere first person. He says, I had fixed my rendezvous with night. So he has been writing sonnets in the first person. Whereas in Savitri, he has placed Ashwapati, and therefore we get all his expressions as a third person. So when he says, he strove to shield his spirit from despair, so that he is Ashwapati here. Whereas my journey was fixed in this night, or I am the pilgrim of the night. That's how we see the personal and the impersonal aspects, expressions coming in sonnets and Savitri. Now next one. We have discussed this of the poem Surrender, and I read a few lines to see how they corroborate with some lines in Savitri. My heart shall throb with the world beats of thy love, my body become thy engine for earth use. In my nerves and veins thy rapture's streams shall move, my thoughts shall be hounds of light for thy power to lose. In Savitri, he writes, a divinizing stream possessed his veins, his body's cells awoke to spirit sense. Each nerve became a burning thread of joy, tissue and flesh partook beatitude. A light, the dun unplumed subconscious caves, thrilled with the prescience of her longed for tread, and filled with flickering crests and praying tongues. Even lost in slumber, mute inanimate, His very body answered to her power. So here Ashwapati has been experiencing this. He has risen to a level where his body cells have woken up to the spirit sense, and his body has answered to the divine power. Similarly, in the poem he says, "My body become thy engine for earth use." Again, the first person and the third person way of expressing things. Now we have another comparison here of his poem, his sonnet, The Self's Infinity, and a few lines from Ashwapati. The Self's Infinity. My life is a silence grasped by timeless hands. The world is drowned in an immortal gaze. Naked my spirit from its vestures stands. I am alone with my own self for space. In Savitri, Ashwapati rises to a level where he is taken up by the omniscience, and there is a descent on him. And then Sri Aurobindo writes, "In a divine retreat from mortal thought, in a prodigious gesture of soul sight, his being towered into pathless heights, naked over its vestures of humanity. As thus it rose to meet him bare and pure, a strong descent leaped down, a might, a flame, a beauty half visible with deathless eyes, a violent ecstasy, a sweetness dire, enveloped him with its stupendous limbs, and penetrated nerve and heart and brain, and that thrilled and fainted with the epiphany. His nature shuddered in the unknown's grasp." A few phrases I would like to highlight here, and then we move on to the last quotation, is silence grasped by timeless hands. And here, his nature shuddered in the unknown's grasp. Then, the world is drowned in an immortal gaze, that is from his sonnet. And here he says, in a prodigious gesture of soul sight. Immortal gaze and soul sight, if we can say, are synonymous. Another line from the sonnet, "Naked my spirit from its vestures stand." In Savitri, naked of its vesture of humanity, his being towered into pathless heights, naked of its vestures of humanity. So we see even the phrases are very similar. The experience, of course, being the same, the phrases are also similar. And the last one, which I would avoid reading here, is a similarity, the sonnet called The Dual Being, which is about the play of Purusha and Prakriti. And we have ample lines in Savitri describing the Purusha and Prakriti, the two who are one, are the secret of all power, etc. So we see that there is a close connection between sonnet and Savitri, because Savitri is his autobiographical writing, is his autobiography, as many of the scholars and researchers have found out. It is his expression, he says how far poetry can be written from one's yogic consciousness. Obviously, Savitri, Sri Aurobindo has risen to those levels where he wrote about all that. And sonnets also, because sonnet is a form which gives voice to the personal, inner, higher life of the poet. So there's a great similarity. And now to conclude of why we took this analysis to prove that Sri Aurobindo was a great sonneteer. Because he experienced, he experimented, he expanded the scope, he laid the foundation of the future poetry in his sonnets as well. He did not just write Savitri as a future epic, because when he wrote in the future poetry about the future forms of poetry, he does not leave sonnets or lyric. He writes about drama, he writes about epic, about the lyric poetry, how it is going to evolve in future, what trend it is going to take up. And he writes a great deal about what the lyric structure, that means the sonnet or the ballad or the ode structure, is going to be in future. One needs to really sit and do a lot of research on each one of them, as to how far poetry has evolved after Sri Aurobindo wrote that. And one of his examples, one of those he himself has exemplified, perhaps not a deliberate attempt, but more as he was experimenting with Savitri, he experimented with the sonnets perhaps. So, and we all know that in Sri Aurobindo's life, everywhere he experimented and experienced and experimented and experienced, and a few things he wrote and a few things perhaps he did not even write. But as a window to Sri Aurobindo's life, as we read Savitri as his autobiography in third person, sonnets are his autobiography, very much in first person, where we see the poet's inner life, a light, a window into his inner life. That is how our master craftsman, Sri Aurobindo the Sonneteer, has proven his theory through his examples, through his sonnets, and left for us his own samples so that we can study, we can follow, we may be able to write poetry from those heights. That is Sri Aurobindo, the Master Sonneteer. Thank you.